There's a moment when closeness stops feeling good to them, not because you did something wrong, not because they lost interest, but because something inside them started to feel exposed. That's when the pullback happens. Not loudly, not honestly, quietly, confusingly. One day things feel steady. The next, they feel distant. And you're left wondering how someone can seem connected and unavailable at the same time. This isn't mixed signals. It's an attachment pattern. Today, you're going to understand the psychological signs of avoidant attachment, not as labels, but as internal reactions. Not what they say, not what they justify, but what actually happens inside them. When closeness reaches a threshold, their nervous system can't tolerate. Because avoidants don't pull away when they don't care. They pull away when it starts to matter. They don't experience attachment the way anxious or secure people do. For them, connection isn't soothing by default. It's activating. Not immediately, not at the beginning. At first, closeness feels safe. Because it's optional, they can engage without consequence. But once emotional consistency appears, once expectations form, once you become predictable, their system shifts. That's the first psychological sign. They become uneasy, not when things go wrong, but when things go right. Stability doesn't calm them, it alerts them, because stability implies continuity, and continuity implies reliance. This isn't conscious. They don't think, I'm getting attached, I should leave. What they feel instead is pressure, a subtle internal compression, like something is slowly narrowing inside their chest. They might describe it as boredom, or restlessness, or the sense that something's off. But what's actually happening is nervous system overload. Their system learned early that closeness comes with cost, expectation, demand, loss of autonomy. So when emotional closeness increases, their body prepares to protect itself, not from you, from dependence. This is why avoidants often pull away right after intimacy deepens, after a vulnerable conversation, after consistency, after you show reliability. The connection crosses a line. Their system associates with danger, and the armor activates. That armor doesn't look like fear. It looks like distance. They get quieter, more logical, less expressive. They start needing space without knowing why. They feel the urge to create separation, to restore internal balance. This leads to the second psychological sign. They regulate emotions through distance, where others regulate through closeness. Avoidants regulate through separation. When overwhelmed, they don't reach out. They retreat. They need space, not to think about you, but to stop feeling. Distance is how they self-soothe. And here's where confusion begins. Because from the outside, distance looks like disinterest. But internally, it's relief, not emotional relief. Nervous system relief. Their body relaxes. When expectations disappear, when no one needs anything, when no one is waiting. That's why avoidance can seem calmer. After pulling away, it's not because they've moved on. It's because their system has returned to familiar territory. Low stimulation, low demand, high control. This creates a pattern. Closeness, activation. Distance, regulation. Over time, they begin associating connection with dysregulation and separation with safety. That's the third sign. They intellectualize emotions instead of feeling them. Avoidants are often very articulate about relationships. They can explain dynamics, analyze patterns, offer rational insights. But when it comes to their own emotions, there's a disconnect. They talk around feelings, not from them. They may say things like, I'm just not in the right headspace. I don't think relationships should feel this heavy. I need to focus on myself. These aren't lies. They're interpretations. Their mind is trying to make sense of a bodily reaction they don't know how to process. Instead of sitting with emotion, they translate it into logic. Because logic feels safe. Feelings don't. This leads to another core pattern. They delay emotional processing. What hits you immediately hits them later, often much later. When the relationship is active, they're busy managing activation. Once distance is created and the system settles, that's when feelings surface. That's why avoidants often feel things after a breakup, not during conflict, not during intimacy, after separation, when there's no pressure to respond. This delay creates the illusion that they didn't care, but caring was never the issue. Capacity was. Which brings us to the next sign. They confuse independence with emotional safety. Avoidants pride themselves on being self-sufficient. They don't like needing people. Needing feels dangerous. So they build an identity around independence. I'm low maintenance. I don't need much. I'm fine on my own. But independence isn't the same as regulation. True independence allows closeness without fear. Avoidant independence requires distance. To feel okay, it's conditional. They can connect as long as they don't feel relied upon. The moment they sense emotional expectation, their system interprets it as threat, and they respond by pulling away, not because they don't value you, but because their nervous system has learned that closeness equals loss of self. This is why avoidants often say, I feel like I'm losing myself in relationships. What they mean is, I don't know how to stay connected without feeling consumed. They were never taught how to co-regulate, so they self-protect instead. And this is where the most painful dynamic forms. Because the more you lean in for clarity, the more they pull back to breathe. You seek reassurance. They seek space. Both are trying to feel safe, but the strategies collide, and the avoidant responds by detaching emotionally, which brings us to another sign. They disconnect under emotional intensity. When emotions rise, they shut down, not out of cruelty, out of overload. High emotion feels chaotic to them, even positive emotion, especially positive emotion. Love, longing, desire. These states demand presence, and presence demands vulnerability. So their system does what it knows. It numbs. They become flat, distant, unresponsive. They may say, they feel nothing. That's not absence of emotion. That's dissociation, a protective freeze. Their body is saying, this is too much. Shut it down. And if you push through that shutdown, if you ask for more, for reassurance, for clarity, their system escalates. They may withdraw further, ghost, end things abruptly, not because the relationship was bad, but because the intensity crossed their tolerance threshold. Avoidants don't leave. When love is absent, they leave. When love feels like exposure, they leave. When love feels like exposure, because exposure means being seen, without armor, and avoidants were not taught that being seen is safe. They were taught that being seen leads to expectation, disappointment, or loss of control. So when emotional intimacy deepens, their system reacts before their mind can explain it. This is where another psychological sign appears. They become hyper-aware of their internal state. They start scanning themselves. Why do I feel irritated? Why do I feel trapped? Why do I suddenly want space? Instead of turning toward the feeling, they turn away from the source. They associate the discomfort with the relationship, not with the nervous system response. So the relationship becomes the problem, not the overload. This is why avoidants often say, I don't feel like myself anymore. What they mean is, my internal equilibrium has been disrupted. They don't yet realize that equilibrium was built on distance. Another sign emerges here. They confuse calm with lack of connection. When things are quiet emotionally, they feel stable. When things are warm, open, intimate, they feel agitated. So they learn to trust calm over closeness, even if that calm comes with loneliness, even if that calm comes with emotional emptiness. It feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. To a nervous system shaped by avoidance, this creates a paradox. They want connection. They crave intimacy. But when intimacy shows up, their body reacts as if something is wrong. So they pull away to restore calm. And then, once the calm returns, they start to feel the absence. This leads to another psychological sign. They miss you only when there's no demand. They don't miss you when the relationship is active and emotionally alive. They miss you when the emotional pressure is gone, when there's no expectation to respond, no need to show up, no requirement to be vulnerable. That's when their feelings surface, because now it's safe to feel. This is why avoidants often reflect. After distance is created, they think more clearly. Once they're alone, not because you were the problem, but because separation lowers nervous system activation. And in that lower state, emotions can finally be accessed. This delay creates confusion for you, because while you were present, they seemed unsure. While you were available, they felt distant. And once you pull back, they suddenly feel something. This isn't manipulation, it's timing. Their system processes attachment backwards. Closeness first activates fear. Distance then allows feeling. Another sign shows up here. They struggle with emotional permanence. When you're not in front of them, emotionally or physically, you fade. Not because you're unimportant, but because they regulate by compartmentalizing. They place feelings in boxes. When the box is closed, they don't access what's inside. This allows them to function without emotional overwhelm, but it also makes them appear detached. Out of sight doesn't mean forgotten. It means emotionally inaccessible until safety returns. And safety, for them, often looks like space. This is why avoidance can seem fine. After pulling away, they're not processing loss yet. They're regulating. The loss comes later, when the nervous system calms enough to let emotion through. Another psychological sign becomes visible. They resist repair, not because they don't care, but because repair requires vulnerability. Repair means admitting impact, naming feelings, acknowledging needs, all things their system associates with loss of autonomy. So instead of repairing, they distance. They hope time will reset things. They hope space will erase tension. They hope things will go back to normal. But normal for them means less closeness, less expectation, less emotional demand. This is why conversations about feelings often feel circular. You're trying to move closer. They're trying to breathe. Neither of you is wrong, but the strategies oppose each other. Another sign surfaces here. They feel overwhelmed by emotional responsibility. Even small bids for reassurance can feel heavy, not because you're asking too much, but because their system interprets emotional responsibility as obligation, and obligation triggers threat. They fear being needed, because need once meant being trapped, so they keep emotional distance to avoid being responsible for someone else's emotional state. Ironically, this often places more emotional burden on you because you're left carrying both sides of the connection, trying to understand, trying to maintain closeness, trying to bridge gaps. And the more you do that, the more they feel pressured, which leads to another sign. They experience closeness as loss of control. Control isn't about dominance. It's about predictability. Avoidance feels safe when they can predict their emotional exposure. Closeness introduces uncertainty. You might want more. You might expect consistency. You might need reassurance. These unknowns feel dangerous, so they pull back to regain control, not over you, over their internal state. And when they regain it, they feel relief, which reinforces the pattern. Pull away, feel better, repeat. Over time, this becomes automatic. They don't even realize they're doing it until something interrupts the cycle, usually silence. But before we get there, there's one more psychological sign that ties everything together. They struggle to integrate intimacy and autonomy at the same time. It feels like a choice: be close or be myself, need someone or stay safe. For secure attachment, these things coexist. For avoidance, they compete. So when love deepens, they don't lean in. They compartmentalize. They create emotional distance to preserve self. And from the outside, it looks like indifference. But internally, it's conflict. A system trying to choose safety over connection every time until something changes. And change rarely comes through explanation. It comes when the pattern no longer works. And that's where silence enters, not as punishment, not as a tactic, but as a mirror. Their nervous system can't ignore. Silence changes the equation because it removes the stimulus their nervous system was reacting to. When you stop pursuing, explaining, reaching for reassurance, their body finally exits defense mode. And only then does awareness begin. This is the part most people misunderstand. Silence does not hurt the avoidant because it feels like rejection. Silence hurts because it removes regulation. For a long time, your presence was doing something invisible. It was stabilizing their system. Your consistency, your emotional availability, your willingness to hold the connection. Even when they pulled back, you were absorbing the tension they couldn't hold. So when you go quiet, they don't just lose you, they lose the external regulator their nervous system relied on. This creates a delayed reaction. At first, they feel relief. No messages to respond to, no emotional pressure, no expectations. Their body relaxes. This is why avoidants often seem fine. In the early phase of silence, they're not indifferent. They're decompressed. But then something else happens. The nervous system settles. And when it does, the emotional backlog surfaces. This is where another psychological sign reveals itself. They begin to feel emotions they couldn't access before. Missing you doesn't arrive immediately. It arrives once safety is restored, once their system believes. There's no immediate demand. That's when feelings slip through. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, in fragments. A memory, a sensation, a thought they didn't expect. They start replaying interactions without the pressure of responding. And because there's no urgency now, they can finally feel what closeness meant. This is why silence often precedes avoidant reflection, not confrontation, not explanations. Stillness. Another sign appears here. They feel confused by their own emotions. They thought distance would bring clarity. Instead, it brings longing. And this disorients them because longing contradicts their self-image of independence. They pride themselves on not needing. So when need surfaces, it creates internal conflict. I wanted space. Why do I feel unsettled now? I feel calmer, but also empty. This emotional contradiction is deeply uncomfortable. So they oscillate, thinking about reaching out, then stopping, missing you, then rationalizing why it wouldn't work. This back and forth is not manipulation, it's dysregulation. Another psychological sign surfaces here. They intellectualize their feelings. Instead of feeling directly, they analyze. They replay conversations to find flaws. They reframe the relationship to justify distance, not because the connection was false, but because logic feels safer than emotion. If they can explain it away, they don't have to feel it. So they may tell themselves, it wasn't that deep. We weren't compatible. It's better this way. But these thoughts often appear after silence, not during connection, which tells you something important. Their mind is trying to protect them from the emotions their body is now allowing. Another sign shows up. They monitor you from a distance, not always visibly, but internally. They wonder how you're doing, if you're okay, if you've moved on. Not because they want to re-engage immediately, but because your absence has created uncertainty, and uncertainty disrupts their sense of control. They don't like not knowing, especially when they no longer feel in control of the dynamic. This is why silence feels so destabilizing. To avoidance, it removes predictability. When you were reaching out, they knew where they stood. They knew you were available. Now they don't. And that unknown creates emotional activation. But here's the part most people miss. This activation does not immediately lead to action. Avoidants don't rush toward discomfort. They sit in it. They weigh it. They suppress it, sometimes for a long time, which leads to another psychological sign. They delay processing loss. Grief doesn't arrive when the connection ends. It arrives later, when the nervous system feels safe enough to allow it. This delay makes avoidance seem cold, but it's actually postponed emotion. They don't feel the full weight until the distance has settled, until routines change, until your absence becomes permanent. And then, sometimes unexpectedly, the impact lands, not as desperation, but as realization. And that realization can be unsettling, because now they must confront something they avoided, that the connection mattered, that you mattered, and that they didn't know how to stay. Another sign emerges here. They experience shame around their inability to attach, not always consciously, but internally. They sense they should feel differently, that others seem to manage intimacy without shutting down. This shame often turns inward or outward. They may withdraw further, or become defensive, or tell themselves they're just not wired for relationships. This belief protects them from trying again, because trying means risking exposure, and exposure is what they've learned to avoid. Another psychological sign surfaces. They associate love with loss of self. So even when they miss you, they fear returning, because returning means closeness, and closeness still feels threatening. This is why avoidance can miss someone deeply and still not reach out. Missing you does not automatically override fear. Longing does not equal readiness. And this is the hardest truth. For those who love avoidance, silence does not guarantee reconnection. It guarantees awareness. What they do with that awareness depends on whether they're willing to face discomfort. Another sign becomes clear here. They test safety indirectly. They may watch, lurk, check in lightly, not to reconnect fully, but to see if the door is still open. If you respond immediately, warmly, without boundaries, their nervous system relaxes again, and the cycle resets. Relief replaces reflection. Distance returns. But if the silence holds, not cold, not punishing, just grounded, something different happens. They must sit with the feeling. No regulation from you, no reassurance, no emotional cushioning. And this is where real change can begin. Because without external regulation, they're forced to self-regulate. And self-regulation is the foundation of secure attachment. This doesn't mean they suddenly transform, but it does mean the pattern is interrupted, and interruption is the first step to awareness. Another psychological sign appears here. They begin to associate distance with loss, not relief. This is new and unsettling because for most of their life, distance felt safe. Now it feels empty, and emptiness is harder to rationalize. You can justify space. You can't justify absence. This is the moment. Avoidant armor cracks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but internally. They start to feel the cost of their strategy, and strategies that once protected them now isolate them. This realization can go two ways. They retreat further, or they soften. But either way, something irreversible has happened. They can no longer tell themselves that closeness was the problem, because closeness is gone, and the discomfort remains. And that's where silence does its real work, not by forcing a response, but by removing escape. Silence is not meant to be a tactic. That's the part most people get wrong. When silence is used to provoke, to punish, to extract a reaction, it becomes another form of chasing, just quieter. And avoidants feel that immediately. Their nervous system can sense when silence still contains expectation, when it's loaded, when it's waiting. That kind of silence doesn't break armor, it reinforces it. But there is another kind of silence, one that isn't strategic, one that isn't performative, one that doesn't watch the phone or measure time. This silence comes from clarity, from the moment you stop trying to manage their emotional limits. For them, this is where the real shift happens, because now your silence isn't absence, it's presence with yourself. And that changes the entire dynamic. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but they're also highly attuned to emotional stability. When you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop holding the connection alone, your nervous system settles. And that calm is felt across distance, not consciously, somatically. They feel it as a loss of control, not over you, but over the dynamic they relied on. Another psychological sign becomes clear here. They realize the relationship was not being held equally. They feel the imbalance only when it's gone. While you were compensating, they didn't need to. Now they do. And this brings up something avoidance. Try very hard not to feel responsibility, not blame. Responsibility, the awareness that connection requires participation, that someone was meeting them more than halfway, and that walking away came with a cost. This is deeply uncomfortable. So some avoidants double down. They tell themselves they're better off alone. They suppress the feeling again. They rearm. And that's information for you. Because silence doesn't change everyone. It reveals. It shows you who is capable of growth and who is committed to avoidance. And this is where the focus must return to you. Because the purpose of silence is not to wait for someone to awaken. It's to stop abandoning yourself while hoping someone else will show up. Another truth emerges here. When you no longer reach, you stop reinforcing the belief that love requires self-erasure. Your body learns something new, that safety can exist without proximity, that worth does not depend on being chosen, that you can be grounded even when someone pulls away. This is the most powerful shift of all, because now, even if the avoidant returns, they return to a different you, one who is not overextended, one who is not negotiating closeness, one who is not collapsing boundaries to keep connection alive. And this is the moment the dynamic truly changes. not because they chase, but because you stop bending. Some avoidants feel this and soften. They sense that access is no longer guaranteed. That closeness must now be mutual. And for the first time, they approach with caution, not because they want control, but because they feel risk. Risk of losing you, risk of intimacy, risk of having to show up. Others don't. And that's painful, but it's also clarifying. Because silence doesn't just break armor, it shows you whether there was ever anything underneath, willing to come forward. And this brings us to the final truth. The avoidant doesn't pull away because you were too much. They pull away because intimacy activates old survival patterns, and silence removes the distraction that allowed them to avoid feeling that. What they do next is not something you can control, but what you do next is everything. Because once you stop using silence to wait and start using it to return to yourself, you stop being defined by whether someone can meet you. And that is the moment your nervous system becomes secure, not because the avoidant changed, but because you did. And from that place, you no longer chase armor. You only meet openness. And that's the line. Everything changes on. If this helped you, see the pattern clearly, not just understand it intellectually. Take a second to stay. Subscribe for more conversations like this about attachment, emotional safety, and breaking cycles without games or manipulation. These videos aren't about getting someone back. They're about helping you stop losing yourself. And if that matters to you, you're in the right place.